The story opens with our protagonist, Lia. She is completely baffled because lately, the Emperor has been acting so incredibly strange toward her. Her dark-haired husband immediately snaps back, asking why she has stopped caring whether or not he has even bothered to eat his breakfast. She responds happily, saying it is only because his health has finally returned to total and complete perfection. The Emperor locks eyes with her, his deep voice trailing off as he pensively repeats that he is healthy. In a sudden flash of jealousy, he asks if his recovery means she is planning to just ignore him forever. Lia laughs brightly, assuring him that her only wish in this life is to see him safe and sound every day. That warms his heart, but Lia is barely listening. She is too busy swooning over how incredibly handsome her husband is. She thinks back on 2 long years of nursing him, managing everything from his meals and sleep to his daily well-being. But the ultimate goal for all of that grueling hard work is finally here. It is finally time to act. She tells herself that the moment to end everything has arrived. Taking a breath, she clearly calls out to her husband. He hears that she has something important to say, so he stops eating and waits with a curious look. Lia doesn't hesitate. With a bright smile, she calmly asks for a divorce, claiming he simply doesn't need her anymore. The Emperor is so shocked he drops his fork and knife onto his plate. His face turns pale as panic lines his forehead. All Lia can think about is her peaceful future, a quiet, single life far away in the serene and sunny countryside. Stunned, her husband asks her once more, is she really planning on walking away from the palace forever? She admits it plainly, noting that this political marriage was a mess that only caused him grief because of her father. She slides the divorce papers across the table. She wants out, and she wants to leave this place immediately. A heavy silence fills the room as he glares at the papers with an unreadable look. Then, his anger boils over and he crushes the divorce papers in his fist. He lets out a long sigh and coldly agrees to her demand. He says they will discuss the details at tea later. Lia's face lights up with pure and unhidden joy. The Emperor smiles gently and tells her to finish eating. She follows along, feeling a massive sense of relief that this is going even better than planned. Lia thinks she has won, but as she eats, her husband watches her with a dark and calculating look in his eyes. That afternoon, a blood-curdling scream shatters the quiet of the palace halls. Everything is about to change instantly. The Emperor was drinking his tea when fresh blood suddenly sprayed out from the corners of his mouth. Lia panics as the blood keeps coming. She screams his name, but he only manages to whisper hers before collapsing on his chair. She rushes to catch her falling husband, frantically screaming for the servants to call the royal doctor immediately. Chaos erupts as everyone wonders what went wrong. Lia feels it too. Something is very, very wrong with this situation. His face is ghostly white. Blood stains his lips, and he looks completely drained of life. The staff rush in to help. The doctor takes one look and delivers the shocking verdict. This was poison. Lia is paralyzed with absolute shock. The doctor's eyes narrow with growing suspicion. He wonders how a careful man didn't notice the strange taste, clearly hinting that someone close must have set this up. The Emperor moans in pain while the doctor stares Lia down with an expression full of doubt. Her face turns white as she realizes the truth. Did he do this on purpose? Did he poison himself just to frame her and stop her from leaving his side? Suddenly, the story flashes back 2 years to reveal the true identity of Lia Celeste. In the tragic novel she once read, this Lia was nothing more than a doomed and unlucky minor character. To highlight the Emperor's cruelty and loss, the author had the Queen poisoned to death very early in the story. Her mysterious death drove the Emperor into a spiral of madness and eventual suicide, which led to the total collapse of the entire kingdom. In the real world, she'd left a mean comment about this ending, joking that she'd like to try living their lives. Suddenly, a blinding flash of light swallowed her up and snatched her away from her world. She woke up to the feeling of a maid gently shaking her awake. As she climbed out of bed, she wondered if God or the author had actually read her stupid and foolish comment. The truth hit her. She was now in the body of that doomed queen. She held her head and screamed internally. She didn't want to be a sacrificial lamb. She quickly took a sip of water to calm her racing heart. But the taste was so foul she had to spit it out immediately. The maids bowed in fear, explaining they ran out of her favorite wine and used a cheap beer instead. I was totally stunned. Bringing alcohol to someone who just woke up? That is a serious problem and a major disaster waiting to happen. Then it hit me. The original owner of this body was a heavy drinker who treated wine like plain water. The maid babbled apologies, swearing it would never happen again, though she clearly feared the gossip starting on her very first day. I waved her concerns away, immediately banning every drop of alcohol from now on and demanding a full report on my entire daily schedule. I paced around, racking my brain for a way to act normal before people started getting suspicious of this sudden change in me. The maid cleared her throat, hesitatingly mentioning the tasks after my bath. Memories flooded back, and I suddenly shouted my first order. Go straight to the harem. Flashes of the queen's dazzling and extravagant harem flickered through my mind like scenes from a movie. I pieced together memories of my husband, the Tyrant Sian. In the original story, he goes insane after his wife dies, destroys the kingdom, and ends it all at age 28. Right now, he is 26 and I am 21, meaning I only have exactly 2 years left to stay alive. Realizing time was running out, I told myself I had to fix every mistake quickly to find a way to survive. Back to reality, I urged my maid Lauren to lead the way to the harem immediately without wasting another second. In the halls, servants whispered about me wasting more money and draining the treasury, even though I had only been married for 3 months. Hearing those insults, I had to gloomily admit that every single thing they said was actually the absolute truth. The former owner of this body spent a fortune keeping countless male consorts, even handing out expensive diamond rings to the winners of her beauty pageants. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. With a reputation for being a drunk and man-crazy, being poisoned felt like a natural consequence. Total helplessness washed over me, and all I could do was lean my head against the wall and sigh. Still, I tried to stay calm. With my high royal status, enemies wouldn't dare attack me directly. They would likely use a slow-acting poison to finish me off gradually. I believed my body still had a real chance to recover. I also had to find a way to keep the Emperor sane to ensure a peaceful future for everyone. Searching my memories, I sighed with relief, realizing my husband never even bothered to mention my harem of men. Suddenly, a maid asked if she should start prepping the beer for later. I snapped back at her, reminding her about the absolute ban on all alcoholic drinks starting right now. But she looked confused, reminding me about the drinking contest decree I had literally issued just yesterday. The prize for the winner was a night with me. Horrified, I waved my arms and yelled, ordering every single bit of that ridiculous plan to be canceled immediately. Breaking into a cold sweat, I told myself I had to fix this body's degenerate lifestyle before it was too late. As soon as I walked in, a line of muscular, handsome men greeted me, showing off their physiques and smiles. A red-haired guy eagerly invited me to sit down, but a black-haired man immediately shoved him aside to take his spot. A blonde guy jumped in, claiming yesterday's victory, while another with brown hair snapped back, insisting that I had always favored him more than anyone else. The men started brawling, tearing at clothes and shouting insults at the top of their lungs. The noise and the sound of breaking glass made my face darken with complete frustration. Everything was such a mess that I had to scream at the top of my lungs to stop the fighting. My anger finally exploded, and I glared coldly at every single one of them as they started to tremble with fear. I firmly ordered everyone to be fired and told them to pack their things and leave the palace immediately. They tried to force smiles and flirt, begging me to reconsider because they supposedly could not live without their precious lover. My icy refusal crushed their hopes as I pointed straight toward the exit. I repeated the expulsion order, making it clear that I would not tolerate any more lingering. The consorts completely broke down, wailing and begging me to take back my decision right then. The blonde one sobbed, crying that if he left the palace, he would have nowhere else to go and nobody to help him. They clung to my clothes, weeping and pleading with me not to be so heartless and throw them away like trash. Trapped from all sides, I frantically looked to the guards for help, but they just stood there frozen in total shock. Suddenly, one desperate man with brown hair drew a sword, threatening everyone else to step back. With tears in his eyes, he brought up our indirect kiss from last night, blaming me for stealing his heart and then turning my back on him. My head throbbed with total, utter helplessness. I realized bitterly that these men were just leeches, draining the hard-earned tax money of poor citizens. I criticized one consort, flatly telling him I didn't like his oversized backside, even as he sobbed that I had praised it endlessly just yesterday. I kept going, accusing another of violating public decency. I snapped at a crying man and told another his muscles were absolutely disgusting, making them all wail that I was being far too cruel. I didn't stop there, mocking the useless hair color of another useless guy. He claimed it happened while playing with me, but I just insulted someone else's bad breath and kicked every single one of them out. After tossing out those annoying men, I stood there panting, completely exhausted from using up so much energy. I scanned the empty room, letting out a long sigh of relief because the noisy crowd finally left. Lauren the maid noticed my sour face and kindly asked if I was feeling under the weather at all. I just turned back and coolly told her I was perfectly fine. She looked confused, saying she understood if tonight felt wrong, but my sudden mood swing left her totally baffled. The maid told me to ignore the court gossip and just focus on resting up for the big night ahead. Then she suddenly suggested bringing in an even more gorgeous young man for me. I waved her off instantly. She just smiled and promised to find a list of the most handsome boys available. I started panicking. Hard. My mind was screaming. Why was I being treated like some kind of sex addict? I needed her to listen. Out of nowhere, a good-looking male servant asked me exactly what I wanted him to do. I froze, staring at him. He smirked, peeled off his shirt, and apologized for not wearing any underwear yet. He even suggested moving to the bedroom if I needed some peace and quiet. My patience had finally snapped. I clutched my head and screamed, shouting that I wanted none of it and needed to leave right now. That bold man kept undressing, asking if I hated his clothes, and threatened to strip completely, making me shriek in absolute horror as the chaos hit a new peak. I barked at them all to get out, wanting nothing to do with this mess anymore. I let out a heavy sigh and collapsed onto the soft bed, face down. Inside, I was cheering. I had finally cleared out those annoying concubines and could finally get some sleep. Rolling across the sheets, I cursed the original owner for leaving me with such a disaster of a life. I guess this was my punishment. But peace vanished when a maid asked what to do with the men still left in the harem. I could not believe there was more. I snapped at her to kick every last one of them out by tomorrow morning. She offered an aromatherapy massage and light dinner, but I was too drained for anything but deep, dark sleep. Then she hesitantly mentioned preparing for my night with the Emperor. That phrase hit me like a physical blow. Was I really about to sleep with that cold, heartless tyrant? Panic set in. This night with the Emperor was never in the original novel. "Lauren," I said, voice shaking. I faked a memory loss, blaming the wine, while sweat beaded on my forehead under her confused gaze. I forced a smile and admitted that I couldn't remember a single thing. Desperate for a way out, I asked if this meeting was absolutely mandatory tonight. The maid explained that the monthly arrangement was a rule my own father had set when I first married. I stood there, sweating, left with no choice. My mind raced to Lia Celeste, a powerful founding father whose noble lineage produced legendary swordmasters and elite diplomats. The queen was beyond shocked. She couldn't believe a man of his power would micromanage something so private as his daughter and son-in-law's intimacy. Even for a political marriage, this was extreme. Clenching her dress tightly, she began to sense that something here was deeply and dangerously wrong. Digging through the memories of this body, she panicked. There wasn't a single shred of information about this marriage or her supposedly powerful father anywhere. Even the marriage contract between Sian and Lia Celeste seemed to be nothing but a blank, empty piece of paper since the very beginning. She suspected this massive information gap existed for one simple reason. The original author probably never even bothered to write these details in. Pure frustration boiled over as the queen clutched her head and screamed. She cursed the novel for being so cruel to a side character's fate, then forced herself to calm down and refocus. She finally realized that in this dark and cutthroat world, the only person she could truly ever count on was herself. Reclaiming her authority, she called out for her servant to prepare for the coming chaos. Leaning forward with intensity, she prepared to face the situation. She questioned them sternly about the preparations for tonight, only to be told that everything was proceeding exactly as usual. Playing the drunk card again, she complained about her terrible memory to fish for details about the daily routine. The maid replied hesitantly, saying the most important thing was to keep her mind and spirit completely pure. A bizarre request leaves everyone stunned. The servant respectfully confirms the order, revealing the reason this emperor is obsessed with absolute, total silence at all times. The queen sighs in relief, happily thinking that this requirement might not be so difficult to follow after all. Suddenly, Lauren panics. She warns that during the last 2 visits, the king became much more violent because the original host could not stop screaming in terror. Hearing this desperate, urgent warning, she must keep quiet to survive the night. The command "never scream" echoes in her mind as masked guards surround her, escorting her down the long hallway toward the royal bedroom. Her mind begins to race as she walks, wondering if a violent man who enjoys hearing screams is actually just some kind of twisted, perverted individual with a dark secret. Standing before the massive bedroom doors, she groans. This nightmare scenario was definitely not part of her original plan. Stepping inside, the vast, cozy room catches her off guard. Once the escort mission is complete, the servants offer their final farewells and leave her completely alone in the silence. The door slowly creaks shut. Her silent scream of terror goes unheard. Trapped in this high-pressure void, the cold, heavy thud of that door slams shut, cutting off every single possible exit. The queen collapses on the bed, muttering about the misery of palace life. Her eyes drift, landing on the ornate ceiling as her thoughts begin to wander. She wonders what her husband could have done to make the original host scream in such heart-wrenching, agonizing pain. Helplessly, she buries her face deep. Sighing at the dead end, she realizes there are no clues about her family or this story. She pushes the worry aside, her fingers tightly clutching the silk blanket. Facing a tyrant won't end well, she tells herself. Best to just hide under the covers and sleep for safety. Wrapped in the warm duvet, her body finally begins to relax into the comfort of the bed. Sleep hits fast, blurring the room. Suddenly, a noise echoes. The Emperor looms over her, his presence so sudden that she jolts wide awake in a state of pure shock. She cowers, peeking through her lashes, certain that the powerful king has finally arrived at her bedside. Without saying a word, he lies down right beside her. Her heart begins to hammer so hard against her ribs. Eyes squeezed shut, she bites her lip, vowing to stay silent and pretend she is in a deep, heavy sleep. Curiosity wins. She cracks one eye open just a sliver to watch his every move in the dark. Instead of a brutal attack, the room stays eerily quiet. The total silence is actually very hard for her to believe. She covers her mouth with her hand to muffle her heavy breathing. It's not nearly as bad as she had first imagined. While his back is turned, she finds herself mesmerized by the man's broad and powerful shoulders. Admiring his silky black hair, she realizes his beauty easily outshines all the noisy, attention-seeking men in the palace. But as she stares, she notices something very strange about the way he is lying there right now. He is lying face down, clutching his ears in pure misery. She wonders if he is implying the ambient noise is too loud. A sudden realization flashes through her mind. Is it possible that this powerful man is secretly suffering from a severe case of obsessive-compulsive disorder? Thinking back to her husband's haunting, war-torn history, pity washes over her. She reaches out her hand, intending to soothe his tightly pressed, pained ears. The moment her fingers brush him, he snaps. He grabs her wrist with a sudden, crushing force that makes her wince. Before she can cry out, he pins her down, eyes wild with intensity. Panting heavily, he snarls a direct command, "Be quiet, right now, not a single sound." She is completely pinned down, but her eyes flicker with recognition. She realizes his violent reaction is identical to a traumatic event she witnessed once before. Ignoring the sharp, throbbing pain in her wrist, the queen bravely whispers his name. Looking into his chaotic, pained eyes, she softly asks if a terrible migraine is the thing that is torturing him so badly. The scene cuts back to this morning, when she was busy managing the rowdy and chaotic palace consorts. At that same moment, deep within the palace's darkest, most hidden dungeon where no light ever reaches, a gruesome sight appears. A prisoner is bound tightly to a cold metal torture chair. Weak pleas for help, the stench of blood, and horrific screams create a suffocating, haunting atmosphere that feels like a nightmare you can never wake up from. Standing in that chamber of sin, the Emperor clutches his pained head. His face twists in agony, fighting both mental and physical pain. The victim's screams echo endlessly, making his mind feel like it is about to shatter into pieces. Traumatic memories flood back, returning him to a long-forgotten past, where a young boy is coldly told by adults never to care about the filth around him. Cruel lessons stole his basic humanity, forbidding the child from ever feeling joy, sadness, or even a moment of pain. Heavy pressure weighed on small shoulders, drilled with the idea that a weak king brings ruin. He had to engrave the prophecy in his heart and devote his entire life to the imperial throne. A lonely child walks alone through the oppressive, pitch-black darkness, carrying a curse that forced him to cast aside all petty emotions. He grew into a ruthless ruler, convinced that any form of emotional attachment was actually his greatest obstacle. Emerging from the blood-soaked soil of a brutal battlefield, he lied to himself, believing that killing his feelings would kill the pain. Standing before burning embers, the king received a hollow blessing on his coronation day. The white-haired mastermind behind the scenes continued his cold manipulation, demanding that the king never stop slaughtering his future enemies. He brainwashed the protagonist with lies, claiming cruelty was the only way to stop the prophecy and save the kingdom. But the endless and bloody wars had finally pushed his emotional limits too far. He had drained his very soul just to survive as the master of the empire. Finally, haunting phantom voices gnawed at his mind like invisible drills piercing his skull, causing him agonizing and unbearable pain. Back to reality in the dark dungeon. Back in the dungeon, a cold courtier with silver hair asked if the emperor wanted to end this bloody torture. The image of a man named Lia Celeste appeared. Juam grunted in agreement. Cromwell coldly reminded the emperor that many enemies were still being held in the dungeon. The old man manipulated him, insisting that he must torture them to put an end to the riots. He reminded the king that he had taken over diplomacy to ease the imperial burden. The silver-haired official then reminded him of his wedding night, receiving a stiff nod of confirmation. The official suggested ending the session so the king could return to his quarters. Sian remembered Cromwell proposed this marriage, and he had accepted despite knowing the man's obvious dark motives, simply because it did not matter who became his queen. But hearing his wife screaming in the bedroom, he thought if he knew she was this loud, he would have refused. The girl was terrified, stammering the emperor's name and begging him not to approach her. Those shrill sounds triggered a massive migraine, making him collapse under the weight of his past obsessions. His hands gripped the bed frame until his veins bulged, desperately trying to suppress the rising agitation within him. On the bed, the queen cowered, covering her ears and sobbing in sheer terror. Recalling their conversation, the emperor had angrily warned Cromwell he wanted absolute silence for the rest of the day. If not, he would not guarantee the life of his daughter. The cruel old man replied with indifference, "The king may do as he pleases." Remembering that, Sian shuddered at how the man spoke such cold words without even blinking. He watched his superior, pitying the daughter abandoned by her own father. It felt wrong for her to die just because of his own impulse. Cromwell's smug and ruthless face was etched deep into the emperor's mind. Back in the bedroom, the queen's soft voice suddenly broke the silence. She looked up at him kindly, asking if he was currently suffering from a migraine. Struck in a vulnerable spot, the king suddenly lunged forward and pinned her down. He growled at her to shut up, thinking to himself bitterly, This woman is just like all the others. She will surely start whining and crying, and he feared he would not be able to control himself. While losing his grip and fearing he might choke his wife, instead, she gently told him to just lie down and close his eyes. Pushing him onto the soft bed, she kindly asked if he felt sleepy yet. The girl continued to soothe him, promising to tell funny stories until he fell asleep. This strange act of comfort left the protagonist completely confused. He lay there quietly, following her lead because everything was so different from his usual daily life. She started rambling about her first love when she was 20 years old. She vividly exposed her cheating ex-boyfriend, explaining why they had to break up, then complained about how petty he was when asking for all his gifts back. The queen went on about giving a luxury fountain pen to a guy named Taylor for their anniversary, only to get cheap cookies he claimed were homemade. He listened to her high-pitched voice and these trivial, endless stories about her petty bickering. The Emperor realized his headache was gone, replaced by a wave of heavy sleepiness. He drifted off while she was still busy praising another guy named Sean. She kept praising that boyfriend's romance and his love letters, even though she was the one paying for every single date they went on. Drowsily, the king wondered how a woman could be so weird, sitting there telling her husband all about her past lovers like this. She wrapped up her story with a radiant smile, proudly declaring she was finally okay now that she had purged every single one of those toxic men from her life. Before falling asleep, the Emperor silently judged that this woman was not nearly as fragile as she appeared to be. Seeing her strength and moving past it all, she softly whispered a goodnight to the Emperor, who was already fast asleep. The scene shifts past a peaceful, dreamless night. The next morning, he woke up and ran a hand through his hair, stunned to find his mind felt incredibly clear and light. He slowly turned his head to the side. His gaze fell upon the queen's peaceful, sleeping face, making him appreciate just how quiet and calm the morning felt. He thought to himself how she had talked his ear off all night, yet here she was, sleeping like a baby. He lightly touched her hand, muttering to himself about the strange bond of marriage between them. The king suddenly realized that sharing a bed with her didn't actually feel as uncomfortable as he had always imagined it would. He could hardly believe the truth that this rare, restful sleep was all thanks to the woman lying right next to him. He reflected on how, in the past, no expensive medicine or rare herb could ever soothe his agonizing headaches and terrible insomnia. Yet, after just listening to her constant rambling, he had actually slept straight through until morning. The Emperor was left completely baffled. What trick did she use? Shaking off the confusion, he let out a long, heavy sigh of relief. He silently cherished this feeling of being refreshed and alert after so many dark, agonizing days. Remembering the times the pain was so bad he had to hand his power over to his father-in-law, the Emperor decided he could no longer allow that. He turned the doorknob, intending to use this newfound mental clarity to finally finish the mountain of backlogged paperwork. Suddenly, the tyrant froze at the door. He turned back, making an excuse to himself that he would work hard on state affairs just to repay her for the restful sleep. Striding through the sun-drenched hallway, the king coldly calculated which of those men still dared to linger within his wife's private palace. Back in the queen's bedroom, she stretched out refreshed, cheering because she had finally gotten a perfect night's sleep. Her maid, Lauren, rushed over with a joyful smile to check on her, shocked to report that the Emperor had actually fallen into a deep sleep very quickly the night before, making her mistress proud of her voice's ability to act as a lullaby. Happily returning the morning greeting, she immediately asked the maid for a breakdown of today's schedule. The maid reported the usual rule that every time the king spent the night, Duke Celeste would arrive for afternoon tea within the next 2 hours. This news hit her like a sudden bolt of lightning. Her face went pale as she wondered why on earth a father would be so overly obsessed with his daughter's private bedroom affairs. She dreaded the thought of him nagging her for grandkids, frustrated that such absurd and suffocating control was somehow considered perfectly normal here. She cursed her luck, realizing that even as a noble queen, she still couldn't escape the parental pressure to have kids just like in her old world. Claiming she had a headache, she hurried Lauren off to cancel the appointment and subtly sent her meddling father away. This request left the maid feeling completely confused and bewildered. After all, this was the meeting the queen had always looked forward to most of all. The queen froze, asking in shock if she really used to be that way, only to receive a slow nod. The maid explained it was a rare day the Duke chose to visit his daughter. This made her scream internally, forced to deal with the tragic backstory of a side character who was desperate for her father's love. However, she quickly brushed aside the pity and determined to shake off that troublesome past since she had zero interest in getting involved in someone else's family drama. Her cold and decisive attitude left the maid breaking into a cold sweat, completely stunned and unable to find any words. Even so, the servant obeyed, figuring that as long as she reported that last night went well, the Duke would leave satisfied and reassured. With that settled, the queen then ordered the maid to immediately summon the royal physician to see her before the day was over. The queen insisted that this be done right away, while also telling the maid to go and prepare her bath water. Deep down, alarm bells were ringing about her character's fate of being poisoned to death. She knew she had to understand her health status immediately to survive the coming danger. The doors swung open, marking the very first step in her plan to stay alive while trapped in the body of the queen. Waiting for her was a blonde physician with a wide, friendly smile, welcoming the sudden appearance of the mother of the nation with open arms. The smooth-talking doctor flattered her, claiming that if she only called, he would have run there barefoot to see her in an instant. Instead of the veteran doctor she expected, the man's flashy and polished looks left the queen in a state of total shock, silently scolding the original owner for her old habits. I was so obsessed with looks that I picked a doctor based on his face. I gave a forced smile, claiming I just needed some advice, while the handsome quack eagerly invited me to sit down. The second I sat down, the man slid over, pressing his body uncomfortably close to mine in a way no subject should. His smarmy smile and lack of boundaries made my skin crawl. I watched him warily, wondering what his real game was. I awkwardly complained that this level of intimacy was way beyond what was required for a medical consultation. The physician just looked confused. Disgusted by how the previous owner's flirtatious habits had corrupted her own staff, I quickly moved away, determined to keep a safe distance from this creep. Putting the annoyance aside, I told him I needed an allergy test and a full physical exam right this second. I questioned him about my current health, assuming that as my personal doctor, he'd know every detail. Instead, the man started sweating. He laughed nervously, admitting he knew nothing about medicine. Seizing the moment, his hand boldly slid up to stroke my thigh. The scumbag whispered that the only thing he understood was the softness of my skin. I felt sick with pure disgust. He started making excuses, saying, the previous queen forbade him from practicing medicine, using him as nothing more than a toy for her private amusement. He wouldn't stop. The smooth talker tried to exploit my loneliness on the throne to manipulate me into more physical contact. Before he could go any further, I slapped his filthy hand away as it reached for my chest. My rage boiled over. I stood up with royal authority. I screamed at his uselessness and ordered the guards to drag him out. As the soldiers hauled him away, the fraud wailed and begged for a chance to make amends, but it was too late. Ignoring his pathetic pleas for mercy, I sighed, holding my head in frustration at the mess this woman left behind. My eyes caught a broken, dusty stethoscope on the desk, a perfect symbol of this entire ridiculous lie. I picked up the junk, mocking the situation. If I kept my life in the hands of people like this, getting poisoned would be inevitable. I turned to my maid, demanding to know who hired this quack. I was floored when she told me the original queen chose him solely because he had a pretty face. Completely drained, I sank to the floor, cursing the previous owner's vanity for inviting such disaster into the palace. Lane rushed over with his files, proving the man actually had a medical degree. But his grades were so pathetic, I knew he must have bought it. As I scanned the resume, I suddenly stopped. My eyes sharpened on the text. My gut told me I had missed something incredibly important. I ripped the papers to shreds. How could the lower officials dare to recommend such a failure as my personal physician? A dark smile touched my lips. I thought this was just about her being shallow, but this goes much deeper. I reasoned that for a complete fraud to pass such strict vetting, someone powerful had to be pulling the strings. Everyone knew the queen was obsessed with handsome men. It was the perfect cover for a trap. I bet the head of the medical institute took a bribe. He likely ignored the rules and handpicked a pretty useless graduate to serve me. However, I wondered what the mastermind really gained by planting such an incompetent man inside the royal harem. Suddenly, the image of the previous queen's bloody, tragic death flashed through my mind. It was the mark of a perfect assassination. Because no one caught the cause of her decline, the poison must have been administered slowly. Lia's death was a calculated murder. I connected this to the king's suicide from the original story I remembered. I suspected his physical and mental collapse was triggered by isolation and those haunting phantom screams. If the queen's own doctor was so easily bought, then my husband's life must be hanging by a very thin thread. Surrounded by danger, I tightened my grip, swearing to crush this sinister conspiracy before it could strike again. I raised my fist with determination, vowing to protect both my own life and the Emperor's. Aiming for a future of peace, I called out loudly for my most trusted lady in waiting. I commanded her to find my husband immediately, leaving the poor servant stunned by my sudden change in behavior. Excited, I announced I had something vital to verify and demanded to know where the king was. Sweating with nerves, she reported that he was currently handling state affairs in his private study. I marched confidently toward the study, ignoring the guards who whispered about what kind of chaos I was about to cause. Standing before the massive golden doors, the two guards quickly bowed low to welcome the mother of the empire. Giving them a bright, friendly smile, she replied warmly and asked if her husband happened to be inside right now. She politely asked them to open the door for an urgent matter. This sudden, graceful attitude left both guards completely stunned and wide-eyed with shock. One guard bowed nervously and tried to refuse, citing royal laws that strictly forbid any unannounced visits without a prior appointment. Refusing to quit, she used her best puppy dog eyes to plead with him, but the guard just sadly apologized again. She finally clicked her tongue and seemed to give up, making the guard sigh in relief as if a heavy weight had been lifted. Out of nowhere, her tone shifted. She bluntly announced that she would just handle it herself and barge right inside. Moving at lightning speed, she slipped past the shouting guard before he could even react. In a panic, he reached for the door, frantically warning her that barging in like this was a grave crime. Ignoring his warnings, she used every ounce of her strength to shove the massive doors open while the guards watched helplessly. The doors flew open, interrupting the king's work as he slowly looked up. He coldly asked what all the noise was about. Having cleared the obstacle, she poked her head in and waved cheerfully at her husband. He frowned, annoyed, and reminded her of the rules against interruptions. She immediately apologized but insisted she had something very urgent to ask. The Emperor's expression darkened as he tried to figure out what on earth could be so important that she would dare break the law. She boldly declared that this was a matter of the highest possible importance. Leaning forward and blinking her eyes innocently, she asked him if he had eaten breakfast yet. The question was so mind-numbingly ridiculous that the Emperor was speechless, staring at her in a long, heavy silence. That heavy silence was shattered as the guards dropped to their knees, heads slamming against the floor. Trembling, they begged for death because they had failed to stop her. Ignoring the soldiers' desperate pleas, she just continued to smile and tease him. "You must be starving after working so hard all through the morning." She innocently invited him to breakfast, but Sian narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious of her sudden and unusual enthusiasm. After a brief moment, the Emperor coldly ordered the guards to leave, while she leaned smugly against the table and waited for him. The guard completely misunderstood and lunged forward, grabbing her arm to drag her away. She gasped, flailing helplessly as he literally lifted her off her feet and hauled her away. She could only scream for him to stop as her body was dragged across the polished, shiny floor. Once she was back on her feet, she waved them off and cursed her husband for trying to get rid of her. Stubborn as ever, she knocked loudly on the door, continuing her relentless campaign to get him to have breakfast with her. Pressing her face against the closed door, she shouted medical advice about how eating 3 full meals a day would improve his sleep quality. To herself, the queen whispered that it wasn't just about that incompetent doctor. She had to get close to the king because those brief, mandated nights together weren't enough to really monitor his health. Thinking about their tragic end gave her a headache, but she knew telling the truth about the future would just make her sound insane. Mapping out her plan, she believed that sharing a meal was the perfect first step toward building a foundation of trust. Beyond that, she plotted to feed him well and fix his sleep schedule, just to ensure this tyrant always stayed mentally sharp and physically strong. Even knowing the risks, she sighed, comparing his cold defenses to a stubborn and difficult Black Panther, but even that wasn't going to be enough to stop her now. I turned to my maid and demanded snacks, boldly declaring I would camp out right there and have a tea party just to test my husband's patience. Before I could finish, I heard a click. An advisor's voice drifted out from the room, pleading with the king to finally get some rest. He stepped out with his secretary, casually dismissing his subordinates' worries about the mountain of work still piled on his desk. He was going over tomorrow's schedule when he suddenly froze, his eyes locked onto me, sitting right there in the hall. Caught red-handed, I didn't even blink. I just sat there, legs crossed in a velvet chair blocking the entire hallway. My husband was speechless. He couldn't believe I was still here, stubbornly refusing to give up after all this time. Seizing the moment, I flashed a radiant smile and asked him to join me for dinner. Facing my sudden burst of enthusiasm, the Emperor secretly cursed me for being so incredibly thick-skinned. Master Lamb figured this was just another ploy to get his attention. Yet, my clear eyes made him curious. He wanted to see how long I'd keep this performance up. I could see he couldn't handle my pleading gaze. He turned away quickly, trying his best to ignore me. He grumbled a reluctant yes to dinner. My eyes widened, filled with a mix of total shock and pure excitement. Mission accomplished. I followed closely behind my husband's broad shoulders as we made our way toward the dining room. At the massive dining table, I started rambling. I asked about his favorite foods and went on an excited tangent about different fruits. She kept pushing the lettuce salad, promising it would finally bring him a deep, restful sleep tonight. Along with it, she served an appetizing plate, highlighting the incredible health benefits of chicken and almonds. More than just advice, the queen promised to ensure the chefs paid much closer attention to his daily menu. Suddenly, she reached out and pointed her finger directly at the Emperor. That bold move made his face darken as he growled, asking what his annoying wife was actually plotting. When she wished him a good meal, he scoffed, mockingly asking why on earth she even cared about his appetite. She slyly lied, claiming that since he was sleeping better, she just wanted him to enjoy high-quality meals too. She stared at his irritated face, searching for a way to provoke him. The queen realized his dinner remained almost completely untouched on the plate. She worried this habit of skipping meals would trigger his insomnia again, turning him back into a miserable, angry man. Cornered, the tyrant glared at her with a threat, warning that she was playing with fire by meddling with a man who could snap her neck at any moment. Though his murderous intent sent chills down her spine, the queen took a gamble, betting he would not do it. Tightening his grip on the silver utensils, the emperor smirked, challenging her to explain that blind, foolish confidence. She boldly argued that the very fact she was still sitting there unharmed was the clearest proof of all. Chewing her food, she analyzed the situation. If he really wanted her dead, he would have done it last night instead of waiting. She claimed her safety was already guaranteed. With a smile, she explained that was exactly why she was bold enough to demand dinner together. He countered that such a tiny reason was never worth risking her life for, eventually forcing her to admit she actually had a hidden agenda for asking. Seizing the moment, she told him how she just fired that useless, whiny excuse for a royal doctor this morning. The queen finished with a daring request to share the emperor's personal physician to help look after her own health. This strange request made the king suspicious. He mocked her for using clever tactics to build power instead of just playing with her male concubines like before. He accused her of being willing to do anything to satisfy her cold ambition. This left the girl confused, wondering what exactly she had said wrong. Realizing he was comparing her schemes to her cruel father's, she panicked, feeling wrongly accused of being a villain. Forcing herself to stay calm, she gave a fake little cough. She made up an excuse that sharing a doctor was simply to help her monitor his health, promising to personally cure his terrible insomnia for good. The emperor finally clicked his tongue and nodded his approval. His sudden answer made the queen's eyes widen in shock, while he calmly picked up a napkin to wipe his mouth. She cheered with joy, but before she could mention any folk remedies to the doctor, her husband immediately shut her down. He coldly dismissed all her efforts to soothe him last night, acting as if he did not care at all. The tyrant glared, threatening that she would not survive if she tried to manipulate him with petty tricks again, making her mumble a terrified, quiet defense. He turned and walked away, throwing back a cold, suspicious judgment. She was not about to give up yet. She called out loudly, teasingly asking if he wanted to continue getting that deep sleep he enjoyed just yesterday. But she only received a scolding for being so outspoken. The queen sincerely expressed her desire to help her husband overcome his terrible insomnia. She shamelessly shouted that he was invited to her room anytime he truly craved a peaceful night of rest. The wooden door slammed shut, leaving her blushing and patting her chest to calm down after such a bold, flirty move. Just as she exhaled, her maids rushed in crying and panicking, demanding a doctor because they thought she had been attacked. Ignoring the chaos, she smiled smugly, admitting that pretending to be that calm the whole time was actually exhausting, but it seemed like her plan was a total success. Having finally passed the hardest test, the queen buried her face in books about poisons, hoping a reliable doctor could help her manage the king's health soon. Her mind was filled with fantasies of divine help, confidently believing that even if the tyrant was not cooperating yet, it was not a big deal. Lia smirked to herself, confident that even if the emperor pushed her away now, he would never let go once he tasted the sweetness of a good night's sleep. She skipped away happily with a new determination to change her husband's attitude, officially marking the true beginning of her grand master plan. From that day on, the queen made it a habit to visit her husband's study room at the same time every single day. She would peek through the door at the crack of dawn, beaming as she asked if he had eaten his breakfast yet. By noon, the girl would boldly swing the doors wide open, trying to tempt him into having lunch together. When darkness fell, the heroine leaned in aggressively, reminding him it was dinner time and clinging to him to beg for a meal together. Faced with her over-the-top enthusiasm, the king only frowned in annoyance before coldly kicking his troublesome wife out of the room. Anger surged, forcing him to massage his throbbing temples. In a ruthless tone, he ordered the guards to drag her away immediately. Beyond his breaking point, the furious tyrant snapped his pen in half. He roared at his servants to throw her out and stuff bread in her mouth to silence her annoying voice, flatly rejecting every invitation. Munching on bread in the hallway, Lia grumbled about her husband's impenetrable defenses. She feared they would both die before she could ever reach her target. Servants passing by began to whisper and gossip behind her back. They mocked her as a pathetic stalker who was always begging for scraps, even spreading wild rumors that her next move was to strip the emperor bare. Hearing those nasty rumors, the queen sighed deeply. She felt utterly humiliated being labeled a stalker, silently defending herself by recalling that the incident where the knight was undressed was actually his idea. However, the young woman quickly pulled herself together. She told herself that staying alive was her top priority, so she wouldn't waste energy worrying about her public image, and besides, things weren't actually that bad yet. Her eyes narrowed with calculation, realizing this thick-skinned campaign had already lasted for 1 full week. This meant the threshold of his endurance was about to break. The heroine was certain the tyrant hiding in the deep palace must have reached his absolute limit. In the silence of the night, she crept to his door and slowly turned the handle. Her eyes blinked as she caught the sound of soft footsteps approaching in the dark, and she pretended to be completely shocked. The queen playfully asked what kind of wind had blown him here at such a late hour of night. Standing before her was the majestic emperor, looking completely exhausted in his messy pajamas and disheveled state. She softly called her husband's name again when he stood there like a silent statue in the doorway. Completely defeated by the agony of chronic insomnia, the male lead lowered his eyes and whispered a weak plea for his wife to lull him to sleep. Seeing her goal met, the girl flashed a triumphant, gentle smile and obeyed his rare request. Moving to another day, a servant tiptoed over to the king's ear to deliver a report. He respectfully announced that the mother of the nation had finally arrived. This made the male lead freeze for a moment in silent contemplation. He immediately dropped his paperwork and ordered the officials to wait, leaving them scrambling to obey. The tyrant strode coldly out of the meeting room without a word. He left his ministers staring after him in total disbelief. The officials began panicking, shouting in chaos because this was the fourth day in a row the king had abandoned his work to meet the queen. One of them even tried pinching his own cheeks to see if he was hallucinating. Ignoring the shock of his subordinates, the king moved forward. He reached his waiting wife, and she excitedly urged her husband to hurry along for their meal. The girl giggled behind her hand, feeling smug about the incredible progress in her plan to tame the beast. The scene shifts to a lavish banquet where the emperor asks how her morning has been. The heroine happily chatted about being busy reading books and walking in the garden, excitedly sharing that she had a wonderful time looking at all her favorite flowers. The male lead chewed his food in silence. He calmly listened to her trivial daily stories. He noted that his wife had been staying put lately, with no intention of going out or partying like she used to. Breaking his train of thought, the heroine's pale hand reached out toward her husband. She casually asked the emperor to pass the pepper from across the table, catching him off guard for a second. Without a single word of refusal, he obediently reached out and grabbed the spice jar just as she asked. He gently placed the item in her hand, receiving a sweet thank you and a bright smile in return. She cleverly flattered him, saying the meal tasted better with his help, while secretly celebrating inside because this was a massive step forward for the tyrant. The meal ended. As the king stood to leave, the queen asked where he was headed. Not at all upset, she flashed a radiant smile and waved goodbye, reminding her husband she would see him late tonight. After seeing her husband off, she sat back down and hummed a happy tune. She ignored her maid, who stood behind her in total shock. Unable to contain her curiosity, the servant stepped forward to ask what magic she used to tame him. The maid excitedly explained the king's miraculous transformation. From a cold man who never left his room, except for mandatory wedding nights. Now he shows up every day like a well-behaved puppy. Hearing the servants gushing, I just sipped my tea slowly, lost in my own thoughts. I wonder if I should call this past week of his stubbornness a successful course in taming a wild beast. Because in the beginning, he treated me like I was completely invisible. I remember that fateful night he begged for sleep and I welcomed him with open arms. Duke, it is time for you to go to bed. I smiled, remembering how hard he tried to resist me. Eventually, he surrendered to the tyrant's soft mattress. He actually looked quite cute while sleeping. Since then, I started talking his ear off, making up endless stories about a fictional maid just to lull my husband into a deep, peaceful dream. Thanks to those tireless whispers right into his ear every single night, the man has become someone who cannot even close his eyes without me by his side. Back in reality, I casually told the maid that my husband must be satisfied with our late-night activities. The double meaning left her standing there in total shock. I just kept acting innocent, pouring more gasoline on the fire. I claimed I gave my all to serve the king every night, making the maid's face turn bright red from her own dirty thoughts. I just grinned, feeling quite proud. I boasted about my success since he seemed to enjoy it so much, never realizing how suggestive my words actually sounded. The maid started sweating while playing along, praising the deep bond of our marriage. I sipped my tea, relieved that my annoying father had finally stopped coming around to bother me lately. After finishing my meal, I stood up quickly, ready to handle the rest of my work before the sun went down. I walked through the halls with authority as the servants bowed and greeted me with deep respect. I opened the door to the sunlit clinic, where a nervous man in glasses knelt to welcome me. My cheerful mood vanished in an instant. I gave the doctor a freezing look and mocked him for his boring, predictable presence. I criticized how useless he was, revealing the man trembling on the floor was actually the famous Mertan. He was the imperial doctor in charge of the emperor. Thinking back to why I blackmailed this quack, I had used my power to lie, claiming that his treatments left me in so much pain I could not sleep. I screamed at him for his lack of self-reflection as a doctor. How dare he treat a royal patient like some kind of bold-faced liar? Now, I leaned on my hand, threatening to see what excuses this smooth talker would use today. I recalled my previous tantrums, demanding medicine despite his advice. The harsh truth was that Mertan's skills were perfect. I was actually in great health. This poor man was only in trouble because he was honest enough to report that nothing was wrong with me. But I figured if a doctor would toss his ethics for power, he could be bought with money too. I needed to know the truth. So I spent 2 weeks pressuring him just to see what kind of man he was. My sharp eyes flashed with a dangerous glint. I told myself today was the final moment for his ultimate character test. I spoke each word coldly, forcing the doctor to give me his most accurate medical diagnosis right now. In the suffocating air, I gave him a stern warning. His very life depended on the answer he was about to give me. I tilted my chin up, waiting for the final verdict from the man whose skin was crawling. His hands gripped his clothes, shaking violently. The doctor stammered as he addressed my royal title. Overcoming his terror, the physician closed his eyes and yelled that I was faking my illness to bully him. Playing the villain, I slammed my hand on the table and stood up. I faked my rage, shouting that his stubbornness was a direct insult to the queen's dignity. A cold, sharp blade was suddenly at his throat, accompanied by a bloody threat. If he dared to call me a liar again, I would kill him. I started a 3-second countdown for him to change his story. The first count echoed heavily. The doctor swallowed hard, sweat pouring down his face in the heat of fear. The blade pressed closer on the second count. He panicked, his legs turning to jelly as death brushed his neck. When the countdown ended, the man shut his eyes tight and screamed for my forgiveness. But he still chose his ethics, refusing to invent a single lie. He declared loudly right in front of the sword that my body was perfectly healthy and disease-free. Just as he finished, the doctor, Quang Truk, broke down again, begging for mercy while promising to use every ounce of his skill to protect the queen's health. The heavy tension vanished instantly as she clapped her hands with a bright, beaming smile, admitting that was exactly the brilliant response she was hoping for. She cheerfully decided to place the royal couple's lives in the hands of a man with such firm medical ethics, despite him being dazed by her sudden change of heart. Ignoring the boundaries between master and servant, she warmly grasped the stunned physician's hands and gave him a very enthusiastic welcome to their new partnership. Strolling along, she felt relieved after settling things with her private doctor, then turned to her maid to ask if the harem was finally cleared out. The maid bowed respectfully, reporting that all luxury items were seized and cleared away as ordered. But one difficult problem still remained unsolved. The girl stammered, explaining the delay was caused by a few stubborn male concubines refusing to leave, causing her to frown in frustration since she had already ordered them to be kicked out without mercy. The maid apologized, breaking a sweat, describing the scene of those leeching men clinging to pillars and throwing tantrums, insisting they see the queen before they would go. She managed a helpless smile, wondering if spending too much time with the original queen had made them catch her stubborn and defiant attitude. Her patience vanished. Fueled by rage, she decided to end this mess personally by being even more unreasonable than they were, asserting her ultimate royal authority over the palace harem. As she neared the closed wooden doors, the noisy shouting about rights hit her ears, making her smirk mockingly at the disorderly protesters inside. She aggressively threw the doors open and stormed in, loudly scolding them and threatening that they were digging their own graves. If they kept acting like thugs, her rage suddenly stalled when she saw not a chaotic crowd, but only the lonely back of a single man standing all by himself. She sighed in relief, smugly thinking that getting rid of this one piece of trash would be much easier than she had first imagined. Her joy was short-lived as the blonde youth began screaming like a madman through a homemade megaphone, loudly condemning the royal family's betrayal and demanding that the queen take full responsibility. She heard the servant whisper that this noisy guy was named Lindo Salo, a male concubine the original queen had taken in simply because she was obsessed with his supposedly sexy brain. The queen could only grimace in helplessness. The scholar held up a hunger strike sign, tearfully complaining about the ridiculous promise to pay his full tuition years ago, bitterly lamenting that being kicked out now would turn him into nothing but an educated, unemployed man, his face twisted with pure resentment. The young man wailed in agony, refusing to accept this cruel sentence of expulsion from the palace. She stood there frozen in an invisible snowstorm, her smile stiffening as she realized she was forced to clean up a truly bizarre and unfair disaster. Not giving her a chance to escape, the youth smugly pulled out a signed contract written in black and white, pointing directly to a clause exchanging his youth for a scholarship. The queen breathed a quiet sigh of relief because at least this nerd wasn't using his body to beg for support like the others did. However, that sense of relief vanished very quickly. It was replaced by absolute horror when she accidentally caught a glimpse of the massive tuition figures written clearly on the debt paper. Staring at the massive 100 million figure, Lia was stunned to realize this tuition was like mortgaging an entire estate. At the same time, she coldly questioned Lindo on whether he had clearly heard the order to leave the harem. She casually waved it off, saying since he had only been there for 2 months, he should just pack up and enroll at the academy himself. The weeping scholar apologized, explaining that the enrollment window only opens once every 4 years, and unfortunately, the last application period ended just last month. He originally planned to take a high-interest loan to apply, but hearing the queen would pay for everything, he naively jumped in here. The queen broke into a cold sweat, realizing she faced a real crisis. If handled poorly, she would be forever labeled a notorious villainess who squandered tax money. Trying to save things? She stammered out a suggestion to find another school and arrange for him to get special admission there instead. And of course, she secretly hoped to find somewhere with much cheaper tuition to save her from the painful cost. But Lindo firmly snatched the paper and refused, declaring with absolute certainty that his life's only goal was the Royal Academy of Pharmacy. The young man claimed with burning passion that even if this basic field of study did not make much money, it was his most precious major, and the course was exclusively taught at that expensive royal school, leaving her completely stunned and speechless. Suddenly, a light bulb went off in her head. The queen realized that pharmacy meant the science of making medicine. If that was true, this scholar could actually brew the antidote to save my life. I finally found my savior. Overjoyed, she thanked the heavens for delivering such an indispensable talent right into her hands at the perfect moment. Regaining her composure, she sternly confirmed the facts. Lindo had graduated at the top of his basic pharmacy class and was now dreaming of advanced specialized studies. Lindo nodded, passionately explaining that his field focused on the science of rare medicines seldom encountered in everyday life. Since demand was low and the difficulty was extreme, only the Royal Academy possessed the resources to teach it. The Empress agreed instantly. Her sudden change of heart left her young protege dazed, wondering what on earth just happened. Reaching out with a powerful smile, she declared she would provide full financial backing for this young man's future. The Emperor's mind began to wander. He thought about how his favorite pastime was sipping hot tea on rainy days. Lying in bed, he watched the back of his wife as she slept soundly. Listening to the raindrops outside felt soothing, like the warmth of tea washing away the exhaustion he had carried for so long. Closing his eyes, he relaxed and let out a soft sigh, admitting a hard truth. Every time he heard the Empress's melodic voice, he found it impossible to resist the wave of sleepiness that followed. Still, the tyrant remained suspicious, determined to figure out what kind of dirty schemes his wife was plotting. But no matter how hard he tried to process everything, he couldn't find a single satisfactory answer. Sitting up and watching her sleep, he realized his biggest headache was staring him right in the face. Back in his study, Xian's lack of focus brought on a sharp headache. Those dry government reports just wouldn't register in his mind anymore. Amidst the stress, his wife's familiar voice echoed in his ears, asking if he had eaten breakfast yet. It kept circling inside his head, images of her radiant, sunny smile. Begging him to join her for lunch, those memories continued to haunt the tyrant's troubled mind. Xian recalled the Empress's demeanor, privately noting that the woman didn't seem to know what anger even felt like. He remembered a meal together. While he sat in silence, she suddenly spoke up, asking why he was acting as quiet as a clam. Her face showed a mix of confusion and disappointment. Her eyes lowered when she received no response at all from across the table. The air grew heavy. He bit his lip, maintaining a strange silence and completely ignoring his wife's simple question. Remembering when he caught her as she fell, the king admitted to himself that he secretly just wanted to hear her voice more. At the same time, he feared that speaking would lead to a stupid question about why she had abandoned her harem. Back in the present, he tried to bury himself in work, his hands quickly signing off on various documents. But chaotic emotions still churned inside him. The tyrant clutched his forehead before his ministers, frustrated and forced to admit something. Even though his mind was unusually clear today, he still couldn't focus on getting a single task done, because the image of that annoying woman kept hovering in his thoughts. Pushed past his limit, the Emperor brushed back his hair. He had no choice but to go and confront her directly. Putting down his pen, he planned to grill his wife on why she was suddenly so caring and what she was plotting. He abruptly stopped working and headed for the Empress's palace. Driven by his decision, the king marched straight toward her quarters at that very moment. But upon arriving there, he coldly asked the maid where her mistress was. Trembling, the servant bowed and gave the bad news. The Empress had already vanished into the harem, claiming she had a critical matter that required her immediate and final attention. Jealousy flared. The tyrant's face darkened as he bitterly realized he had been played like a fool. He barked an order to turn around, strictly forbidding his attendants from uttering a word about today's embarrassing incident. The scene shifts deep into the Empress's lavish, gossip-filled harem. On the way back, Xian angrily replayed his wife's sweet words of concern in his mind. Feeling resentful, he wondered how she dared to care for him, then suddenly run off to her concubines. He was certain she was just trying to provoke him. While the tyrant seethed, the story shifts to another perspective. The girl in the Empress's body was groaning in exhaustion, her muscles aching after days of working far beyond her limits. Xian thought back to his wife's charming appearance. He questioned himself, sensing the Empress expected nothing from him, and he bitterly admitted he had no right to expect anything either. The king continued analyzing her motives, believing that as the daughter of the cunning Celeste, she must have a plan. She clung to favor only to benefit her family, making every move from the start a cold calculation. Memories of catching her soft frame in his arms suddenly came rushing back to him. The Emperor quickly suppressed the urge for warmth and affection from such a manipulative wife. The tyrant smirked in self-derision. Why would a man who treated people like trash for years crave useless emotions now? Recalling the moment he left her palace, Xian clenched his fists, trying to swallow the mounting bitterness. Completely lost, he couldn't fathom why his heart was thumping with such painful, heavy beats. Let's set the Emperor's inner turmoil aside. Lia is back, happily closing a very lucrative new deal. She demanded the young nerd commit himself entirely to her service. He would serve as her exclusive pharmacist for the next 2 years. In exchange, she promised to cover his entire royal tuition. Though she feared Lindo might be a plant for her enemies, she decided to gamble on him for now. The queen sat back, connecting the dots. She realized the men around her only used their looks to bait her, knowing she loved the flattery. The ones pulling the strings definitely knew about this fatal weakness. She reasoned that the assassins wouldn't bother with a complex plot to plant a new killer. They knew she was easily lured by beauty. Her eyes shifted, judging the man standing there with a sign, claiming to be on a hunger strike. She was momentarily blinded by the pure, crystal-clear look in Lindo's eyes. Seeing his passion for pure academic study, she knew she had to recruit him instantly if he wasn't already a puppet. The young scholar happily accepted the job offer. He eagerly asked if she wanted strength boosters or immortality pills, making her cringe at his wild, unrealistic ideas. But against all expectations, a single sentence from the queen's lips completely froze the young man's entire brain. Without wasting time, she gave the first and most vital task to her newly appointed personal pharmacist. He was to throw himself into the research of deadly poisons. Lindo broke into a cold sweat, cautiously asking what she needed such dangerous items for. She could see the suspicion in his eyes. The queen explained she needed antidotes for protection, never knowing when someone might try to take her small life. Hearing that, the young man grinned and agreed instantly. The lightning-fast change of heart left her totally speechless, finally putting pen to the contract. She warned that this research was dangerous, demanding he protect her safety since their lives were now permanently tied together. Pushing up his glasses, the nerd smiled meaningfully and accepted the terms, adding a very subtle threat of his own. He pointed to an imaginary news article, making a bold, brazen threat. If the queen ever broke the contract, he'd expose her secret poison research to the entire academic world and the press. Facing the unexpected cunning of this young man, the girl started to break out in a cold sweat. She marveled at how careful and calculated he was. Not wanting to lose, the queen warned, no quitting and no side jobs. If he lied, she would strip his scholarship and throw him into a dungeon for deceiving the royal family. Terrified, Lindo quickly backed down. He swore to serve the queen with total loyalty after tasting just how ruthless she could really be. Getting to work, the pharmacy valedictorian pulled out a blackboard to sketch his plan for the road ahead. As he wrote, Lindo correctly guessed the queen's real goal was survival, but he immediately asked if just barely surviving was enough to satisfy her true royal ambitions. The pharmacist explained that antidotes aren't miracles. They neutralize toxins but cannot heal permanent damage deep within the vital organs. This grim information made the leading lady turn pale with fear. To keep her body healthy, he proposed fighting fire with fire. He advised building resistance with mild medicinal herbs, promising the only side effect would be a little bit of fatigue. Reacting violently, she screamed, asking if he was actually trying to force her to drink poison. But the young man calmly explained it was a necessary step to help her body adapt before taking real antidotes. The nerd puffed out his chest, confidently promising to measure the doses perfectly based on her physical condition. He even gallantly offered to be a guinea pig and tested himself first if she still hesitated to take a sip. Watching the pharmacist's burning passion, she breathed a quiet sigh of relief and calmed her racing heart. Thank God she kept him around, because if she had kicked him out, she would definitely be drowning in trouble right now. To avoid prying eyes while sourcing poison at the market, Lindo suggested growing the plants right there in the royal gardens. He then showed off his stash of forbidden seeds, making the queen realize she had almost unleashed a literal ticking time bomb on the public. Once the farming plan was set, she frowned, calculating how to expand her influence by recruiting discreet servants who could quietly maintain their secret garden without raising any outside suspicion. Just then, Lian suggested using those useless male concubines who were currently weeping and clinging to the porch pillars. He was certain that if they were promised not to be evicted, those homeless men would eagerly take the bait. She happily nodded in agreement, smugly choosing 3 of those men to serve as cheap labor, and then excitedly ordered them straight to the garden to start digging today. The scholar's eyes widened in total shock at her cold, calculated precision. He sarcastically noted how quickly the queen had transformed into a penny pincher just to save the kingdom's rapidly draining treasury from total collapse. Annoyed, she flashed a dark smile and threatened to cut his expensive scholarship and ship him off to some cheap foreign school, making him realize he had majorly messed up. Knowing his place now, the pharmacist dropped to his knees, begging for forgiveness while shamelessly praising his master's brilliant intellect. The queen tilted her chin up and forgave him with a stern warning to watch his mouth next time. With everything settled, she excitedly raised her teacup in celebration. She toasted to a successful day of recruiting both the doctor and pharmacist, finally seeing a tiny glimmer of hope for a peaceful future ahead. But in the middle of her joy, the sharp snap of a breaking pen tip shattered the peaceful atmosphere like a cold blade. Cut to the study, where a poor pen snapped into pieces under the king's violent and crushing grip. The officials standing around were trembling, their faces pale as ghosts. By their count, that was the 12th pen to be sacrificed by the king's hand just today. Unable to take the frustration anymore, the tyrant slammed the table and stood up as the phantom voice of his wife's breakfast invitations echoed in his ears again. He stormed out of the suffocating office, his heavy and angry footsteps echoing through the long, narrow halls. As soon as his back disappeared from sight, the terrified servants collapsed, shedding tears of pure, unadulterated relief. They hugged each other in celebration, grateful to have survived those moments of extreme and life-threatening tension. One curious man nudged his colleague, wondering why the emperor's temper had become so unpredictable and foul again after such a long period of calm. The other whispered that the king's rare streak of kindness actually started when he grew closer to the queen, and that strange change was the real mystery worth discussing. They all began to gossip, wondering if the young royal couple was currently going through some kind of heated argument. Even though every day they still saw the shameless tyrant dragging himself over to crash his wife's dinner table for a meal, no one knew the real answer. The officials could only sigh in exhaustion at their fate as puppets caught in the line of fire. One servant clutched his head in fear, terrified that one day his own neck might share the same fate as those poor broken pens, a haunting thought that gave him terrible nightmares every single night. All they could do was look up and pray to the heavens, begging the Almighty to help the king find his calm again so they might actually survive. It turns out the king's foul mood was actually being fueled by constant hallucinations. He admitted to himself that he kept waking up in a panic because he could hear her melodic voice calling out to him. Led astray by these visions, the emperor felt a deep sense of shame every time he walked out, only to return to his desk. So he found himself reluctantly following her ghostly image outside time and time again. But this terrifying haunting didn't just stop when the sun was up. Even when night fell, the tyrant would wander unconsciously in the dark, moving just like a sleepwalker possessed by a spirit. Then, upon waking up suddenly, he was shocked to realize he had instinctively crawled right into bed with the queen without even knowing it. Hiding his face, which was flushing deep red with shame, he bitterly questioned himself, wondering when exactly a notorious tyrant like him had started to see the presence of his annoying wife as a habit he simply couldn't live without. He sat there glaring at his wife's back, deeply suspicious that she was playing some kind of trick. Meanwhile, Lia was breaking into a cold sweat, feeling his sharp gaze practically drilling a hole into the back of her neck. Utterly confused, she forced a stiff smile and wondered what on earth was going wrong this time. They were supposedly getting along well, even while sitting and eating at a very great distance apart. She resentfully sliced into her meat. Depressed, she realized that the distance between them had returned to a big fat zero, wrapped in that same old heavy silence. Despite the heavy tension, she found it ironic that the tyrant still ate and went about his daily routine with such unsettling calm. I told myself not to rush. If this were easy to fix, the original novel wouldn't have ended in such a bloodbath. Watching my husband's lonely silhouette, I realized that for a man who spent his life suppressing every emotion, opening up would be his hardest battle yet. I won't give up. I'll stay persistent and be the one to finally crack his icy exterior. I cleared my throat for attention, softly asking if anything weighed on his mind lately, while adding he was free to punish me if I had done anything wrong. His lip twitched before he coldly denied it all, but I wasn't about to let his lies slide so easily. I used my fingers to pull my eyes up, mimicking the terrifying glare he'd been aiming at me lately. To add drama, I pretended to wipe away tears, sobbing that his look absolutely terrified me. He just let out a cold, mocking scoff. He pointed out that someone sitting there eating so calmly didn't look scared in the slightest. My act was busted. I just ignored him, casually cutting my meat while asking if he was actually just sulking with me over something. I gave him a bright smile. If you aren't mad, just relax. You'd look much friendlier that way. Hearing my blunt words, the emperor's lips parted, visibly shaken as that strange, nameless feeling surged through his chest again. To hide his nerves, he snapped back coldly, telling me to just mind my own business, leaving me startled by such a harsh, ruthless rejection. I pouted in disappointment, mumbling about his cold attitude when I was only trying to lighten the mood. Watching my sad face, he started to waver, wondering why she looked so genuinely let down if this was all just a game. He began to doubt his own suspicions. The wall between us was finally cracking. The tyrant wondered, could this woman actually be sincere with him? He quickly justified her visit to the harem, reasoning that she only went there to clear out the old favorites, not to meet anyone. He mocked his own jealousy. With that self-brainwashing complete, he closed his eyes and sighed, feeling like he'd wasted energy worrying over such a trivial matter. Seeing him relax, I cheered up instantly, happily admitting that as long as he wasn't angry, I was truly happy. A soft, genuine smile finally touched his lips. With his mind clear and the fog of suspicion lifted, he started seeing things differently. He realized my father, Duke Celeste, wanted him driven to madness just to keep him under control. Because of that, he saw that her caring for his health went directly against the old man's cruel plans. This made him even more curious about her real motives. The scene shifts to the queen's room. A knock at the door breaks the silence. It was the Emperor calling for her headmaid. He asked Lauren if she'd given the mistress a good excuse. Then he got straight to the point. He interrogated the maid about my sudden change, desperate to know why I was suddenly so devoted to him. The maid calmly replied that her mistress was always unpredictable, and while cleaning out the harem, she simply found herself a brand new hobby. He was speechless that his health was being treated like a woman's pastime, but he decided to let it slide for now. He sternly ordered the maid to ensure the empress stayed far away from the other men in that harem, and she obeyed. The maid added that she was now into gardening, even planning to send the old favorites to work the soil. At the mention of concubines, his gaze turned sharp and cold. He demanded a full explanation, his killing intent filling the room. The tyrant's face darkened, fuming over why those men were still anywhere near his wife's private quarters. The story shifts now to the bright, sun-drenched royal gardens. Out in the yard, the harem boys were groaning, their muscles screaming after days of grueling physical labor. A young man named Hade rubbed his aching shoulders, sweat pouring down a face exhausted by the unaccustomed heavy work. Taylor, the blonde, chugged some water and laughed. He was just grateful his friends convinced him to stay in the palace. The scholar in green nodded bitterly. In this economy, jobs were scarce. For a guy with nothing but writing skills and a pretty face, free housing was a total steal. They laughed together, ditching their old delicate ways to enjoy the pride of finally earning a living through their own hard work. During their break, they whispered about their mistress. She was different now, kinder, and she had finally put down the bottle. As they praised the queen for sponsoring Lindo's education, the greenhouse door was kicked open. Someone screamed in pure terror. They huddled together, trembling in fear. They hit the floor, shaking. When they realized the intruder was the tyrant emperor, their hearts nearly stopped beating. His eyes burned with murderous intent. He threw a death stare at the men, cowering like animals on the floor. They scrambled to their feet, begging for mercy. The emperor ignored their pleas and coldly announced he had one thing to ask them. His sharp eyes reflected their weak figures. Then, his voice dropped to a low, dangerous rumble. The question hit like a thunderclap. Which of them had actually slept with the queen? Total silence. The boys exchanged panicked looks, sweating through their shirts. Would telling the truth get them killed? They remembered her warning. The queen had banned all talk of her private life, threatening severe punishment. They were caught between two monsters, like tiny fish among hungry whales. Obeying the emperor meant offending the queen. Either way, they were dead men walking. Panic set in. Admitting they had cuckolded him to his face felt like digging their own graves. Losing control, the male lead pointed his gleaming sword right at their trembling throats. He threatened to end them right then and there if they stayed silent. The sharp blade touched an artery. The tyrant growled, demanding to hear every sweet word the queen had whispered in their ears. Facing death, they squeezed their eyes shut and prayed for the queen to somehow save them. The air was heavy. That blade was not moving back. Under the pressure, one guy broke. He sobbed that she only told them to work hard if they wanted food. Suddenly, everyone started spilling the beans. They confessed her only rule was that if they did not sweat in the fields, they did not eat. The room went deathly quiet. The emperor stood frozen. His sword was still out, but he was baffled by such a bizarre answer. Trying to save face, he cleared his throat and asked about his wife's sleeping habits instead. The boys were sweating bullets. They guessed randomly snoring, yawning, anything just to stay alive tonight. Looking at their blank faces, a shocking truth emerged. No matter how much she favored them, not one had ever shared her bed. They remembered that ridiculous beauty contest where the prize was a night with the queen. But the new queen had crashed the event and canceled the whole messy thing. One cried out that she just got drunk and stumbled back to her room alone. Seeing how pathetic they were, the sharp-witted tyrant realized it. These three were still virgins. They never touched his wife. The knot in his chest finally loosened. His rage vanished. He snapped his sword home. He turned and left, pardoning them all to finish their gardening. Leaving the three boys sobbing in relief, the emperor turns to a maid to ask about his wife's whereabouts and demands to be led to her office. Striding down the hallway, the tyrant smirks to himself. Those harmless parasites aren't a threat, so he decides to confront her and clear up any lingering misunderstandings directly. Just as he reaches the heavy closed door, his footsteps falter when he overhears his wife's sharp voice, threatening to punish someone severely if she were to suddenly faint. Then, a stranger's confident voice rings out, making his eyes widen in a sudden surge of jealousy as he kicks the door open and storms inside the room. His gaze locks onto the scholarly young man, instantly judging this refined stranger to be nothing more than a lingering remnant of his wife's former harem at the palace. Unlike the terrified men in the garden, the emperor notices this man acting with an incredibly natural and intimate air toward the empress as they speak. Irritated, he wonders what kind of secret business they are hiding behind his back. Eavesdropping, he hears his wife obediently asking the man for advice on wearing long-sleeved outfits. Jealousy boils over as the tyrant grinds his teeth, fuming that this lowlife would dare to interfere with something as personal as his wife's wardrobe. An earth-shattering bang echoes through the room, signaling the emperor's sudden and violent arrival. Startled, the empress spins around and blankly asks what ill wind could have possibly blown him into her office today. Without a single word, the murderous tyrant lunges forward, drawing his blade and pointing it directly at the scholar's neck. The youth turns pale while the empress screams in a state of sheer panic. With a look that could kill, he growls out his command, ordering the young man to identify himself immediately or face the consequences. Lindo breaks into a cold sweat and gulps. He bows deeply and respectfully, stating his name and clarifying his history as a former hired hand within the palace harem. The emperor snarls, demanding to know why this man is still loitering around his wife without permission, especially since the official order to close the harem was already issued to everyone. Seeing the situation turn dangerous, the empress rushes forward to settle the heated dispute. She explains that she thought hiring staff for her own palace was within her authority, so she decided to act on her own. Hearing her usual sweet tone used for another man, the veins on the tyrant's forehead throb with uncontrollable rage. Jealous, he snaps at her, asking why she would dare use such a gentle voice to defend another man right in front of him. He presses the sword deeper into the boy's neck, basically accusing her of hiding an assassin to murder him. He claims her actions are a direct threat to his safety. The empress screams her innocence, asking out of pure frustration if he is simply looking for any excuse to chop her head off right now. Glaring at a glass jar, the tyrant demands to know exactly what she is holding in her hand. Sweating, she lies and says it is just massage oil, secretly terrified that her secret plan to take poison would be exposed to him. Using her clever wits, the empress promises to use that oil to massage her husband tonight, claiming it will help him sleep better. The servants blush and turn away, completely misinterpreting the suggestive nature of her bold promise. Still not appeased, the emperor grumbles about using products made by her favorite servant. She quickly brings up the man's excellent pharmacy degree to justify keeping him on her personal palace staff for now. She playfully narrows her eyes and teases him, asking if her husband is actually just jealous and letting his wild imagination get the better of him. Caught off guard, the emperor snatches the bottle from his wife's hand with a sudden and decisive movement. He tosses the item back to Lindo, coldly stating that he could easily hire a far more distinguished and skillful pharmacist for his wife if she truly needed professional help. The air freezes as the cold metal of his sword is raised high, ready to take the life of the man standing in his way. The tyrant delivers his bloody verdict. He fiercely declares that he will eliminate this eyesore immediately and forbids his wife from voicing any objections to his final decision. Facing his murderous aura, the empress sighs, realizing the moment of truth has finally arrived after days of false peace. She remains surprisingly calm and collected through it all. She remembers his fatal weakness is panicked, screaming, which easily triggers the tyrant's dangerous descent into madness. Flicking her hair back, she offers an agreement that is both decisive and shockingly calm. She accepts his bloody decision without a single hint of protest, fear, or even hesitation. Her indifferent attitude leaves Jian shocked and wide-eyed. In total confusion, he asks her if she is really giving him permission to take this young man's life right now. She bows elegantly and declares with smooth flattery that as a humble subject, she would never dare to stop the son of the empire from doing exactly what he wishes. Her sweet words leave the emperor stunned. He drops his murderous gaze and quietly studies his wife's unusually obedient behavior, searching her face for any sign of a hidden motive. The tyrant lets his arm fall, lowering the deadly sword and leaving the empress standing there, calling his name in complete confusion. Observing his exhausted expression, the empress gently asks if he is suffering from one of his usual agonizing headaches. She playfully complains that it is not yet time for his afternoon nap and invites her husband to stay a while longer with her. She sips her relaxing herbal tea, ending the noisy drama with a bright and radiant smile that hides her true intentions. He softly offered to have everything ready right away and invited her to the tea room. She was more than happy to accept. Behind them, the young scholar just kept sobbing. The emperor turned his attention back to the pharmacist, asking how he should be handled. She replied calmly, "You may dispose of him however you wish." The young man crept up and whispered that if she hadn't taken his side, the tyrant surely would have killed him, making her jump. Right after that, the shameless consort signaled with his hand, boldly demanding that his master give him even more money. While his wife looked flustered, he seemed quite pleased. He smirked and gave a quick nod, agreeing to the request instantly. Once they were settled in the tea garden, the emperor gently scolded her. He said if she had a headache, she should have told him. She was still feeling anxious, convinced that her husband was actually furious with her. Instead, he softly asked if she had been feeling unwell lately. She couldn't help but nod and admit that he was right. He thoughtfully pushed a warm cup of tea toward her, suggesting she take a sip to help her feel a bit better. Then, he sat back and crossed his legs, sipping his own drink with a completely calm and relaxed attitude. From a hidden corner, two maids watched the couple and whispered that the emperor had been acting very strange lately. One servant shared a shocking rumor. Some of the male consorts in the palace had nearly lost their lives. Luckily, no one died, leaving the other girl wondering how they actually survived. The first maid just shook her head, not knowing the reason why. But she went on, saying she heard that the empress herself had ruthlessly demanded they all be executed. The brown-haired maid frowned thoughtfully, wondering if the tyrant was just testing the empress to see how she would react. She argued that a harem full of men was a royal disgrace, so he probably just wanted to see if his wife had truly changed. But the other maid quickly dismissed that idea, insisting that the king was actually just acting out of jealousy. The brown-haired maid waved her off, thinking the whole idea was just completely ridiculous. But the black-haired girl kept insisting that her friend should listen to her side of the story. She eagerly pointed out that the royal couple had clearly been getting much closer to each other lately. Then suddenly, those consorts were called in to be questioned about the empress's sleeping habits. She's certain the king was mad because they knew her. But once he found out they never actually shared a bed with her, he calmed down and spared them. It was a clear sign of jealousy. However, the brown-haired maid was still very skeptical about it. Shuddering at the thought of the emperor's cruelty, she insisted there had to be some deep political conspiracy hidden behind his recent actions. She told her friend to stop reading those silly romantic novels and come back to reality. But the black-haired maid just smiled confidently and told her to wait and see what happens next. He is definitely head over heels for the empress now.